For days, nothing changed, and no one explained why, because the rules that once defined captivity did not disappear suddenly, but began to fade quietly, without warning or announcement. There were no new orders to follow, no corrections to anticipate, and no familiar signals to confirm where obedience ended and choice began, and this absence unsettled the men far more than strict discipline ever had. They waited for authority to return in its familiar form, but as the silence continued, a deeper uncertainty took hold, raising a question none of them were prepared to answer. What happens when control no longer needs to speak? From the earliest days of their captivity, structure had been one of the few elements the prisoners could rely on without question, because even in defeat, rules created a rhythm that removed uncertainty and replaced it with predictability. Orders determined when to wake, where to stand, how to move, and when to remain silent. And this constant guidance allowed men to function without having to interpret their situation on their own. Discipline did not merely organize daily life. It provided meaning. Each command confirmed that authority still existed in a recognizable form, and that captivity followed a logic the prisoners understood, even if they did not accept it. In this environment, obedience required no reflection, because the boundaries were clear and the consequences well defined. Yet over time, that clarity began to soften in ways that were difficult to identify at first, because nothing dramatic marked the shift. There was no announcement of new policy and no visible change in leadership. Instead, small details began to change quietly, often unnoticed until they accumulated into something unmistakable. Roll calls became less rigid, sometimes ending sooner than expected, while inspections lost their former intensity, no longer accompanied by the same careful scrutiny of personal belongings or appearance. Instructions were still given, but with less repetition and less urgency, as though compliance was assumed rather than enforced. At first, most prisoners interpreted these changes as temporary adjustments rather than meaningful shifts. Camps required manpower, guards rotated frequently, and routines could change for practical reasons. There was no reason to believe that authority itself was retreating. As a result, the men continued to follow habits learned long before their capture, making beds precisely, forming lines without being told, and maintaining silence even when conversation was not explicitly forbidden. This continuation of discipline occurred not because it was demanded, but because it felt safer than uncertainty. Order had become a protective mechanism, a way to preserve stability in an environment where little else could be controlled. To abandon it voluntarily felt premature, even irresponsible. However, as days passed without correction or consequence, the absence of enforcement became increasingly difficult to ignore. Jackets remained unbuttoned without comment. Conversations extended longer than usual without interruption. Small deviations accumulated, and yet no response followed. What unsettled the prisoners was not the behavior itself, but the lack of reaction to it. In the past, even minor departures from routine had been met with immediate correction, reinforcing the boundaries of authority. Now, those boundaries seemed less defined, not because they had been removed, but because they were no longer being actively reinforced. This shift forced each man to confront an unfamiliar question. If no one intervened, who was responsible for maintaining order? And if order was maintained without instruction, did obedience still serve a purpose, or had it become an automatic response disconnected from authority altogether? The camp did not feel freer, but it felt different, as though the structure that once held everything in place had loosened just enough to create space for doubt. Discipline remained visible, but its source was no longer clear, and that ambiguity proved more unsettling than rigid control ever had. By the end of this early phase, the prisoners had not yet reached conclusions. They had only begun to sense that captivity was changing, not through force or punishment, but through silence, and that the disappearance of clear rules might carry consequences they were not prepared to face. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the absence of clear instructions continued, the prisoners began to notice that what sustained order inside the camp was no longer the presence of authority, but something far more internal and less visible. Discipline did not collapse when enforcement softened. Instead, it persisted quietly, carried forward by habit, memory, and a deep reluctance to abandon structure without knowing what would replace it. Men still woke at familiar hours, even when no signal demanded it. Beds were made with the same care they had shown since the first days of captivity, and lines formed naturally before meals or work details, not because guards insisted on it, but because no one felt comfortable being the first to stand apart. Routine continued, not as an obligation, but as a shared instinct. This behavior did not reflect loyalty or submission. It reflected caution. Discipline had once provided clarity, and clarity had offered safety. Without clear rules to follow, maintaining old routines felt like a way to avoid provoking consequences that might still exist, unseen and unpredictable. Yet subtle changes began to emerge beneath this surface of continuity. Small decisions that had once been automatic now required thought. A pause before standing, a glance around before speaking, a moment of hesitation where instruction used to exist. These were not acts of defiance, but signs that obedience was no longer entirely unquestioned. The prisoners became more aware of one another, because in the absence of external correction, behavior itself became information. Men watched how far others went before stopping, and whether silence would be broken by reaction or ignored entirely. Each small action carried weight, not because it mattered greatly, but because it tested an environment where boundaries were no longer clearly marked. Some prisoners clung tightly to discipline, enforcing routines upon themselves with even greater precision than before. For them, structure offered identity. Without orders, discipline became a personal responsibility, a way to preserve a sense of purpose in a space where meaning was slowly eroding. Others, however, began to relax their behavior slightly, not as rebellion, but as an experiment conducted quietly and cautiously. These differences did not create conflict, but they introduced distance. Men who once moved as a single unit now carried themselves with subtle variation, each responding differently to the same silence. Conversations became shorter and more measured, not out of fear, but because uncertainty discouraged openness. Without clear rules, even trust felt harder to define. What made this phase particularly unsettling was the absence of feedback. Actions no longer produced immediate response. Behavior existed without confirmation. In the past, authority had clarified what was acceptable through correction and repetition. Now, silence offered no such guidance, leaving each man to interpret meaning where none was provided. Over time, this lack of response shifted the burden of responsibility inward. Obedience was no longer something demanded from above, but something chosen, consciously or unconsciously, by each individual. This choice carried weight because it could no longer be justified by command alone. Discipline, once enforced, had become internalized. The camp had not become disordered, but it had changed fundamentally. Control no longer depended on visible authority. It relied on habit, mutual observation, and the quiet pressure to conform without knowing why. In this environment, the prisoners began to understand that rules did not need to be spoken in order to function. By the end of this stage, discipline still shaped daily life, but its source was no longer clear. The men followed routines not because they were told to, but because abandoning them felt more dangerous than continuing. And within that realization, a deeper question began to form, one that would soon extend beyond routine and into identity itself. As the camp remained quiet and formal enforcement stayed distant, the prisoners began to sense that the most immediate pressure around them was no longer coming from guards, schedules, or shouted commands, but from the people living beside them. In the absence of clear rules, the men themselves began to shape what was acceptable, not through open confrontation, but through observation, expectation, and quiet judgment. At first, this shift was subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary adjustment. Men still formed lines, still kept their spaces orderly, and still moved through daily routines with a practiced caution. Yet beneath the surface, the social atmosphere began to change, because without external correction, each prisoner became more attentive to how others behaved, and behavior became a kind of signal that could not be ignored. Small deviations carried meaning in a way they had not before. A man who spoke too freely, who laughed too loudly, or who stepped out of routine even slightly could draw attention, not from guards, but from fellow prisoners trying to understand what the new silence meant. In a system where rules were no longer clearly stated, unusual behavior felt risky because it introduced uncertainty into an environment already defined by it. This pressure did not appear as aggression. It appeared as distance. Conversations became more cautious. Groups formed more tightly around familiar faces. Men who had once shared the same routines began to separate into those who valued strict order and those who seemed willing to accept loosened boundaries. The division was not ideological in any formal sense. It was psychological. One group sought stability and discipline, while the other sought relief in small freedoms that carried no obvious consequences. For the men who preferred strict routine, the silence of authority felt like a test that demanded restraint. They believed that maintaining order was the safest path, and that any visible relaxation might provoke an unseen response later. For the men who relaxed their behavior, the absence of correction suggested that strict enforcement might never return in the same way, and that continuing to behave as though it had was a form of unnecessary self-punishment. Neither view provided certainty. The result was a quiet tension that shaped daily interactions. A man who kept to routine could be seen as rigid or fearful, while a man who stepped outside, it could be seen as careless or unpredictable. The camp did not become hostile, but it became watchful, as though every small decision could influence the stability of the group. The psychological weight of this watchfulness was profound, because it changed the source of control. Guards remained present, yet distant, while the prisoner's attention became sharper and more immediate. Men began to measure their own behavior not against written rules, but against the reactions of those around them, and those reactions were rarely spoken aloud. This created a new kind of boundary, one that was invisible yet powerful. In the past, the line between acceptable and unacceptable was drawn by authority through punishment or correction. Now, that line began to form through social pressure, through the fear of being seen as the one who disturbed the fragile balance of quiet order. In this way, the prisoners themselves became the most immediate force shaping behavior. Over time, the silence also altered trust. Without clear external rules, it was harder to know what others might do, and unpredictability became more unsettling than strictness. Men became more careful about what they said and to whom they said it, not because they expected betrayal, but because uncertainty made caution feel necessary. Even friendships carried new weight, as though loyalty had to be measured under conditions where the structure of captivity no longer explained itself. By the end of this phase, the camp remained orderly, but the nature of order had changed. It no longer depended on authority announcing itself, but on prisoners maintaining equilibrium among themselves. The rules had not returned, yet discipline continued, reinforced not by guards, but by the quiet pressure of living under a silence that no one could interpret with confidence. As the silence continued and the camp settled into a rhythm no longer defined by spoken rules, the prisoners began to experience a change that went beyond discipline or social pressure, because it affected how time itself was perceived. Without clear commands to mark beginnings and endings, the days started to lose their edges, blending into one another in a way that quietly unsettled even those who appeared most composed. In the early stages of captivity, time had been structured by authority. Orders divided the day into clear segments. Inspections created transitions, and routine gave each hour a recognizable purpose. Even hardship had shape when it followed a schedule. Now, with fewer interruptions and less visible enforcement, that structure softened, leaving long stretches of time that felt undefined rather than controlled. Morning still arrived, but without urgency. Work details began without the same sense of initiation, and evenings settled in without the familiar feeling of completion. The camp continued to function, yet the rhythm felt slower, as though time itself had become heavier. Without external signals to measure progress, the prisoners found it harder to distinguish one day from the next, and the passage of time began to feel less like movement and more like suspension. Some prisoners attempted to recreate structure through personal routines, not because they were required to, but because repetition offered a way to anchor themselves. They walked the same paths, performed tasks in the same order, and marked time through habits that had no official meaning. These rituals did not restore clarity, but they reduced the discomfort of existing in a space where nothing clearly advanced. Others reacted differently, becoming increasingly aware of how little separated one day from the next. Without clear markers, memory began to blur. Events that once felt distinct merged together. It became harder to recall when certain changes had occurred. The absence of structure did not erase time, but stripped it of reference points, leaving duration without definition. What made this shift particularly disorienting was that it occurred without visible hardship. The prisoners were not being punished more severely, nor were conditions deteriorating in obvious ways. Instead, the weight came from monotony itself, from living within a silence that offered no sense of progression or resolution. Time was no longer something to endure toward an end. It became something to inhabit without knowing where it led. This altered perception affected how the prisoners thought about the future. In the past, even under strict rules, the end of captivity could be imagined as a point reached through endurance. Now, without structure to measure endurance against, that imagined endpoint felt less concrete. Waiting lost its direction, and patience became harder to define when nothing indicated that movement was occurring. The guards did nothing to correct this drift. They maintained their routines with consistency, neither increasing pressure nor reasserting control. Their indifference reinforced the sense that time inside the camp no longer needed to be shaped actively. It was allowed to unfold on its own, without commentary or adjustment. As weeks passed in this manner, The prisoners began to understand that captivity was no longer defined solely by restriction, but by duration without meaning. The absence of rules had not created chaos. It had created stillness. And within that stillness, time itself became one of the most challenging elements to endure. By the end of this phase, the camp felt unchanged on the surface, yet profoundly altered beneath it. Discipline remained, order persisted, and silence continued, but the sense of forward movement had weakened. Time no longer pushed the prisoners toward anything. It surrounded them, quiet and unmarked, shaping captivity not through force, but through the slow erosion of distinction between one moment and the next. As the weeks passed and the absence of clearly spoken rules continued without interruption, the prisoners gradually stopped treating the silence as something temporary or suspicious because nothing arrived to contradict it. No authority returned to restore the familiar structure, and no event occurred to mark the end of this phase, allowing the quiet to settle into daily life until it no longer demanded attention. What changed first was expectation. The men no longer waited for orders to resume their former rhythm, nor did they anticipate a sudden tightening of discipline to correct what had loosened. Instead, they adjusted to a reality in which guidance was no longer provided moment by moment, and where daily life unfolded without instruction. The absence of rules became predictable, and predictability replaced uncertainty. This normalization altered how responsibility was experienced inside the camp. Without explicit commands, each prisoner became more aware of his own decisions, even when those decisions were small and repetitive. Choosing when to move, when to speak, and when to remain silent carried a different weight now, because those choices could no longer be attributed to obedience alone. Responsibility shifted inward, quietly and without ceremony. The persistence of routine under these conditions revealed something the prisoners had not anticipated. Discipline did not vanish when enforcement faded. It endured not because it was demanded, but because it had become internal. Years of conditioning had shaped behavior so thoroughly that rules no longer needed to be stated in order to be followed. Habit replaced authority, and memory replaced command. Yet this internal discipline came at cost. Without external structure to justify obedience, many prisoners began to question the purpose of maintaining routines that no longer served a clear function. Beds were still made carefully, paths were still walked in familiar patterns, and order was still preserved, but the reasons for doing so had become unclear. Routine persisted, but meaning did not always accompany it. This gap between action and purpose created a subtle strain. The prisoners were not distressed in an obvious way, nor were they driven to defiance. Instead, they experienced a quiet form of fatigue, one that came from sustaining order without understanding why it was necessary. Discipline had once provided clarity. Now it demanded effort without explanation. As this condition endured, adaptation took on a new form. The men no longer tried to interpret the silence or assign intention to it. They stopped asking whether authority had weakened or withdrawn, because the question itself no longer produced useful answers. Instead, they accepted the silence as the environment in which they lived, allowing it to shape behavior without engaging it directly. In this stage, captivity felt less confrontational and more immersive. The prisoners were not reacting to control. They were living within it, even as its visible expression had faded. The camp did not feel freer, but it felt settled, as though the structure had dissolved into the background and no longer needed to assert itself. Over time, this quiet acceptance reshaped identity. Men who had once defined themselves through obedience or resistance now found those categories less relevant. The absence of rules did not invite rebellion. It invited adjustment. Survival no longer depended on responding correctly to commands, but on maintaining coherence in an environment where guidance was absent. By the end of this phase, the prisoners understood that the disappearance of rules had not removed control. It had transformed it. Authority no longer relied on voice, presence, or enforcement. It existed through routine, habit, and internal restraint, shaping behavior without drawing attention to itself. And in that realization, the men recognized that captivity had entered its most enduring form. The silence was no longer something to be questioned or endured temporarily. It had become normal, woven into daily life so completely that it no longer needed to announce its power in order to remain in place. By the time the prisoners fully adjusted to the quiet absence of rules, captivity no longer revealed itself through orders, discipline, or visible authority, but through something far more subtle and enduring. What surrounded them now was not a system that demanded obedience, but one that no longer needed to ask for it. The silence had done its work slowly. It had reshaped behavior without confrontation, reinforced routine without instruction, and transformed discipline from an external force into an internal condition. The prisoners continued to live within structure, even as the structure itself faded into the background, no longer requiring explanation or enforcement. What made this form of control so difficult to recognize was its lack of drama. There were no punishments to resist, no commands to question, and no moments of crisis to define the experience. Captivity did not tighten. It settled. And in settling, it became part of the environment rather than something imposed upon it. The men were not compelled to obey. They simply continued to do so, guided by habit, memory, and the quiet pressure of maintaining coherence in a place where guidance had disappeared. The rules had not been removed. They had been absorbed, woven into daily life so thoroughly that they no longer needed to be spoken aloud. In this environment, freedom was not denied aggressively. It was made irrelevant. Choice existed, but it carried weight without direction, leaving obedience as the easier path, not because it was required, but because it was familiar. The absence of instruction did not invite rebellion. It invited adaptation. By the end, the prisoners understood that captivity had taken on its most enduring form, one that relied not on force or fear, but on internal restraint. Authority no longer announced itself. It endured quietly, shaping behavior without ever raising its voice. And in that silence, the men learned that some systems of control are strongest not when they command, but when they no longer need to speak at all. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.